we're on. Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. For those that might be out there or will see the recording later.
And happy birthday to Mr.
Oh,
Kennedy.
it's not till Sunday, but I'm going to make it a whole weekend. I got a happy birthday boy pen from my boss and the department secretary with a lot of Reese's peanut butter cups and a Reese's peanut butter cake. Eat after this talk.
I will hopefully share.
Yes, well, share. Simon, you're welcome to come across the street to get some. So welcome. This is a continuation of an ongoing series on the book, Incidents of the Life of the Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, written by herself, first published in 1861. And just to give you everybody an overview of what we're going to do today, we've done a number of talks in the past, focusing on certain themes: the patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, slavery, the antebellum, or summarizing chapter sets. Today's talk is going to be a little bit different. I'm joined here with Dr. Jacki Miller. And the reason why I've invited her today is just to let you all know, I know students, you guys are greatly impressed with me when I walk into the classroom, but understand I only have a master's degree, which means I wrote a little bit here and there and got some attaboys and then a credential. And stopped at the next level of the journey in studying history, not going into the PhD. Dr. Jacki Miller did. She pursued her PhD, and so she's going to be able to talk to us a little bit about what goes into the painstaking task and efforts of research and providing unique and valuable scholarship to the field of history. And so this is going to be a valuable conversation. And the reason why this is going to be a valuable conversation is this book itself is the product of an historian who took the time to go through the stacks, to go through letters, and to do research, to take probably a lot of hits to her and her reputation early on. She was able to redeem that. But I'm sure she received quite a bit of blowback considering the source, because we'll get into the controversy of the publication and what followed about 100 years later. So today will be a very instructive view of what really a historian does day to day and why it's valuable. And it's kind of a thankless job. It's behind the scenes, and we don't really get a preview or a bird's eye view of what an historian does. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But I thought before we get started with all of that, especially for those that might be just being assigned this book for the first time and have never seen any of these podcasts, Jacki, why don't, if you will, can we just briefly just summarize the contours of this book and what's going on in this story?
Sure. Well, the book is a firsthand memoir of a woman who was born enslaved and who eventually managed to escape. But the process from point A to point B was pretty complicated, and she had a very unique story in that she was born to a family that had more freedom and opportunity than a lot of other slaves. They lived in their own home with her brother and her mother and her father, and she was very close with her grandmother and extended family as well. And so it wasn't until her mother passed away when she was 6 that she really came to the realization that she was a slave. And she was sent to live with her mother's mistress, who fortunately was a very kind woman who saw a spark in Harriet and taught her how to read. And so she had some privileges that not many slaves did. But eventually, her new mistress passed away as well, and she was willed to another family, the Northam family, and actually to the young daughter. And that's when her life began to be pretty difficult, because in moving to that family's residence, she started to become subject to the wilds and wishes of the father, James Northam, who was a doctor in the community. he was a sexual predator, to put it bluntly, and he had, extorted sexual relations with a number of the slave women in his ownership, and Harriet was well aware of that. And she was aware that that was a consistent pattern amongst slave holders generally. And so she reflects on the fact that a lot of the slave children on these plantations are the product of this forced relationship between the masters and the women that they enslaved. And this created a special tension for her because she, had grown up in a family that considered itself very respectable. And she considered herself to be strongly religious and moral, upstanding. She didn't want to cave into the wiles of her master and avoided him assiduously. And he realized that she could read and write, and he then tried to pass her secret messages to convince her, I'm going to treat you so well if you'll just become my mistress. But she refuses. She comes into a lot of tension with the man's wife, the mistress, who is very aware of her husband's proclivities and does not like that Harriet has been kind of singled out as a beautiful young woman, a lighter-skinned African-American woman. But eventually, she takes it upon herself to take another lover, as much as that sort of contradicted her personal values. She had a couple of children, hoping that that relationship would deter the master, Dr. Norcombe. It didn't really, but it did give her a bit of agency over her life, and she spent several years living with her kids and her grandmother. And eventually it just became so unbearable that she decided to run away. And she was helped by an extensive network of people in the local community, but she couldn't get far without a really excellent opportunity. And so she ended up staying in a tiny space in her grandmother's attic room over like a garage type place.
Big as underneath this table and slanted.
Yeah, so
7 years.
Yeah, 7 years in that position before they finally felt like they had the golden opportunity to spirit her away onto a ship that was northbound. Eventually she did make it, and she wasn't totally free once she made it north. This book continues to talk about how her master was still pursuing her, and she had to really hide her identity and rely on the people who employed her to keep her safe.
She was very apt at tricking him too.
Yes, she was very smart.
Making him lose lots of money.
Yeah. So that might have been longer than.
No, that was perfect actually. That was excellent. Yeah. So, that's the contours of the book, and before we go into what it means to be an historian, perhaps we conclude with the significance of this book. And I would say the significance of this book are in two parts. One, we could assign the textbook that will talk about the 30 million people that were forcibly taken from Africa to the Americas, and then you read about how it was brutal, people got whipped, killed, sexually assaulted, and that's in section 3 of chapter 3, and then you're highlighting it, and it's not easy. It's just what it is. It's very abstracted. It's just, okay, you might have a sentiment in your mind, in your heart, this sounds like it was bad, and that's about the extent of it. The significance of a slave narrative like this is you get to see on a very myopic view of what it is like for an individual to endure this, and the people that she cares about that surround her, what it was actually like day to day. And she was a very adept writer, so you also get this very enriched narrative of what it was like. These people are the characters in this book who are real. She does use pseudonyms just because when she is up north, there's something called the Fugitive Slave Act. She is not legally free. She can be taken at any second, and her owner is pursuing her. So she needs to be careful, not just for herself, but the people that she loves and cares about. but yeah, you do get a view of what it was like day to day and the nuance of slavery. I mean, with the thing that you brought up, she didn't know she was an enslaved person until she was 6. She had a very unusual circumstance as an enslaved person during her childhood. Her father, she calls him a carpenter, but the way she describes, I would say he was more of a master architect, and had a great deal of freedom. And it didn't look like they were independently wealthy, but it certainly appears that whatever they needed, they could provide for their children and their family. It was a middle class upbringing, basically. So very unique in that way. And then you really get to see the extent of agency, as limited as it was, that people like Harriet and other slaves were able to express and exert to protect themselves, to express just their basic humanity. This is a very enriching book. And the other thing too is, what is there, about 12 major slave narratives that have been published?
I know.
Yeah, something, about a dozen of them, like Frederick Douglass is probably the more famous one. But correct me if I'm wrong, all of them written by men, right?
Yeah. Except
for this one. And so that's not rah, yay for women. There's one out there. That is, what's significant about that is slavery was horrible for everybody, but as Harriet is going to point out, it's uniquely horrible for women, especially young women who are coming into sexual maturity due to the systematic opportunities and the incentives really for enslavers to outright rape their slaves.
And to be fair, there were abolitionists before the war that were talking about this problem amongst women. The Grimke sisters had grown up in the South, and they were aware of this problem of the forced rape and whatnot. And they talked about it in the audiences that were aghast. Yeah. First of all, that they were women talking in front of a crowd.
Yeah.
But second, because they're talking about sex, right? Yeah. And Harriet Beecher Stowe also writes this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that talks about
we'll get to her.
Yeah, the woman really the mother who stands to lose so much within the system of slavery, because her children can be torn away from her at any time. So yeah. The women's role isn't unspoken, but it's very interesting to get the first person perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what really makes it. She could have written this in third person, which would have been fine, but I think from the first person, it really immediately grabs your heart and says, oh, this is really what it would be like when hearing I did this and he did this to me and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, just an aside, the Grimke sisters, yeah, so these were daughters of abolitionists. So one, that's weird, speaking out against slavery, or not abolitionists, of slave owners. And two, yeah, to my understanding, people who might have been, and they're speaking in the South too, who might have been fully in support of slavery, are going to see these women speak just to see if women can actually speak in public. Because this is, because of the prejudice and the misogyny at the time, it was just thought that would be physiologically impossible for a woman to functionally speak in public. And boy, were they wrong, right? And they got more than they bargained for when they heard the Grimke sisters speak. We will jump into talking about the person who has really brought this book to our attention, Jacki Miller, Fagan, who is an historian that went through the archives, went through the letters, published a series of volumes that comprised of letters of hers, her family, people like other abolitionists and feminists like Amy Post or Marie Child, who was the original editor of the original publication of the Incidents Life of the Slave Girl. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, before we get that, let's just share your experience with doing research, what's entailed, some of the setbacks that you experience, and what anybody who might be going this field should expect, your accomplishments, and things that you specifically have contributed that are pushing forward the scholarship in the field that you have pursued.
complex question there, Sean.
Sure, let me know when you're done.
So, as a researcher, I've gone through a lot of phases of development, and I've experienced a couple of different ways of approaching research, and I think that these are commonly recognized for historian scholars, especially those that are just starting out, including our students. History majors write research papers for the academic co-op, and I talk about how you can write a story or history that is driven by a question that is burning within you that you want to know the answer to, or you can research and write a story based on the sources that are available to you. And I think it's very clear that Fagan Yellin had read this story and she was driven by a passion to know, was it real? So she's going with a question-driven approach, and she's really grasping at straws to figure out where are some resources that could lead me to a definitive answer. Is this a real memoir, or is it, as many of the scholars had said at that point, was it just a production by abolitionists, a fake? I have done kind of both things. I've gone to a library, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. I spent some time there when I was just a sophomore in college. And
as an undergraduate?
Yeah. And I wanted,
how cute.
I know, right? And I wanted to do some research on Eleanor Roosevelt because I found her a fascinating person. And the librarians kind of said, you know, there's a lot of material on this community called Arthurdale that she was interested in during the presidency when she was First Lady. And so I kind of evolved from there and did some research as an undergraduate about her work developing this community and being an advisor. And I looked at a couple of different projects, especially. One of them was like a craftsman's workshop that she was trying to promote as a way to reskill the miners who lived in Arthurdale, to teach them to make craftsman furniture in the Appalachian style. So she's creating kind of a folk art center. And then I also looked at the school system in Arthurdale, which I argued she had a lot of influence on because she had been an educator herself and was kind of an idealistic person regarding educational reform during the progressive era. She had a lot of friends who were involved in settlement house projects, and she had founded a school called Todhunter in New York City in the 20s and had been a teacher there, at least part-time. And these were privileged children that went to this school, but she wanted to bring some of the same mission and ideas to the children at Arthurdale. So she's someone who was versed in educational theory at the time. And I talked about how that played out in the realities of this experimental community and school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When I was in graduate school,
So she was a pioneer in educational theory.
Well, yeah, I mean, at least in terms of
Following the line
she
of John
followed,
Dewey.
yeah, she followed the progressive theory of the time and sought to apply it more broadly. And, yeah, she was in the milieu of a lot of people who
Just
were,
wasn't the first lady hanging out at the White House.
no, absolutely not. She was very active in her own right, and she continued after her husband died. In graduate school, I shifted courses a little bit, and I decided to focus on the history of rural banking, financial history, which may sound incredibly different, and it is, but in the sense that Arthurdale was a community, and the things that I was studying in grad school were communities as well, small ones with people, you know, interacting with one another and, you know, affecting the course of this whole community. There was a little bit of overlap. And I've always been interested in Western communities and Western history in general. So I wanted to look at something that was very personal to me because my dad is a agricultural banker, or at least was before he retired. And I found it really interesting how bankers had this really odd relationship within the community. Like they know everybody's dirty secrets, like what their balances are in the bank book and whether they're making their loan payments and all of that. And that creates a little bit of social tension in a small community. But they also do so much for their community. They become philanthropic leaders, and historically, they've been involved in politics as well. So I wanted to look at bankers in how they affected all of these different areas. Financial development, this is kind of a frontier narrative of transforming the raw landscape into an Anglo-American vision of what civilization was. But then I also looked at politics and social history. So I looked at a lot of newspapers. I was kind of guided again. This is something that you just go to a historical society and do a search. Can I find anything on this topic? And I found a few glimmering references to bankers. I started out with one big collection by a guy who had served in the Kansas legislature several times. And so he clearly had a sense of history in the making. And so he left his papers behind, saved everything. There were a few other kind of passing references, people who'd written memoirs themselves that talked about the early days of banking. So I kind of mined those for examples. And then after that, it was just kind of a matter of telling people what I was doing and having people contact me. And that happened because I was looking at every regional library I could to see if there was more material. And I went over to the university library at Kansas, and they didn't really have a lot of material in this area. They didn't really do economic history as an archive, but they now knew that that's what I was doing. And so when a member of the board of a bank in Western Kansas came to them saying, can you house this set of record books? They said no, but we know of a student who is doing research on that subject. And so kind of like Fagan Yellin, she told her story and what she was looking for, and people contacted her over the years. Hey, I found this thing that is relevant. And so some of it is kind of fortuitous and luck based.
Serendipity.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of how I did my research. There's a lot of time spent in your seat in the archive, combing through file boxes that are kind of musty and old, very delicate. There's a lot of time spent pushing the button or cranking a microfilm machine.
Yeah, explain that to
there's
21st century students.
Nowadays some newspapers are digital. Most newspapers that are produced for today's public are digital, but they've also put some older newspapers online, and at the library you can find some of those, but usually they only go back so far, like maybe 20 or 30 years. And while there are projects to put historical newspapers online, it takes a lot of time and money to do that. And so the majority of what you want is on microfilm, which is an older technology. It's basically like a roll of film, essentially, that you run through a reader, and it presents it on kind of a flat, lighted panel so that you can review the newspaper. And it's going to be several years worth of newspapers on a single film. And what's the value of that, you might ask? Well, newspapers are a way of accessing what ordinary people are thinking and doing and looking at. Because it's usually only a certain type of person that's going to leave record of what they thought was important. And a lot of ordinary people don't do that. I also looked at census records to be able to sort of flesh out more of what the communities were like, find out some background, family connections. I went to the bank commissioner's office to look at like historic bank charters. I was really just trying to find pieces of the story wherever I could.
Excellent. So when you're looking at, to go back to the microfiche, when you're, it's basically like a goggle lens that you're looking at.
It wasn't quite that bad.
Okay.
The ones that the Kansas State Historical Society actually had a button that you could press instead of a crank, and it was a large screen that was lit from behind, so you could see like a whole panel as we're standing there.
And it had a pretty sophisticated search window that you could type into.
Oh,
I'm just kidding.
yeah.
No, you have to comb
You
through
are
it. Yeah.
your own search.
Gotta use this thing.
Yeah, there's no Boolean search terms, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's pretty tedious and time consuming.
Yeah. So what was the fruit of all of this endeavor that yours? Any publications that you can point to?
Yes, well, the initial fruit was a dissertation, which is the product that every historian at the PhD level, the doctorate level, produces. I am working on getting that transformed into a published manuscript as a book. But I have also published pieces of it as articles. And I also did some research on the Federal Reserve System a while back. I was learning more and more about how financial systems worked in this historical period I was looking at, like right at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I got involved in a project to explore Kansas City's financial history and social history. And I wrote about the foundation of the Federal Reserve there, and then I did some more work about the one in St. Louis. So that was helped along by more digitized archives, which was very helpful to me because some of this research I did
fully appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when you're writing an article, explain what the process is. So you've done the research, you've typed it out. Now what? Do you just send it out and it's automatically published, and then you get all these accolades for it? Or is there something that gets in between that?
There's a drafting process, to be sure. The first article that I wrote on the Federal Reserve actually started out as kind of a workshop where everybody came together and talked about what they were working on and presented maybe a part of what you had been writing, maybe an argument and some pointing towards or alluding towards the sources that you intended to use to help prove your argument. And then we did a public presentation and solicited feedback on that. And then it was the long process of polishing your drafts, and the editors of the volume have to figure out how everything fits together and write an introduction, and go through several phases of revisions and publishers' proofs and things like that. So it takes a long time, not just on the research side of it and the writing side of it, but ultimately the editing and finishing part of it.
Yeah. And do any of these articles have to go through a peer review process? I had
Yes.
When I was in graduate school, our professors gave us some experience with that. We would actually read other graduate students' work, and you would do a peer review. You would review it and critique it and offer suggestions.
Yeah.
So you went through that process.
Yeah, I mean that's what's essential to the scholarly process. That's how everyone knows that historians aren't just writing a bunch of bull, right? Because we talked about, history does have a certain level of subjectivity to it. It's going to tell a different story based on the sources that you are using and highlighting. And somebody like me might make an argument that's completely different from somebody else, what they would draw from the same sources. But you do this process of scholarly review and critique so that everyone knows that you are consulting the proper, secondary sources as well as primary sources, and that you're not leaving out something really essential. So yeah, absolutely. Anytime you publish an article or a book, you're going to receive that peer review from scholars in the field.
I was reminded of why this is so important. There was a podcaster that I followed, a guy named Daryl Cooper, that was recently in the news. Very well read guy, quite conservative, and that's what I appreciated about him, because not to make anything of it, but I'm not conservative, but here's a well thought out guy. He gives this kind of conservative view of historical events, but he got in a little bit of trouble. He was on a Tucker Carlson podcast, and he basically is an amateur historian, right? He's a very well-read individual, has loved to read, but that's not his field. I think he's a private contractor for the federal government in the armed forces, right? And so, but he's this kind of guy that's always got his head in the book. And anyway, he was on this podcast, and World War II came up, and I guess they were reflecting on a recent podcast where the chief, this is according to this guy, Daryl Cooper, the chief villain of World War II was not Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill. And so what I was thinking, it was garbage what he was talking about. And what I was, to be fair to him though, is like, if you were an actual historian, or even as an amateur historian had other historians read your work, even if you wanted to have the view that the chief villain was Winston Churchill of World War II, some historians could have provided him some nuance and saying, okay, I don't agree with what you're saying here, but you might want to consider this scholarship and this scholarship. Here's an article that you probably want to read if you ever want this thesis to have any respectability. But instead, just a well-read guy is just kind of spewing the stuff out into the public. And you know, I think going forward, this guy, he'll still be able to make a living because there's an audience for that, but he's never going to have any kind of respectability going forward after that debacle. So it's basically a safeguard for not just the truth, which is always a subjective thing, but for the profession itself and the individuals that are pursuing that thing, because you could step into some serious landmines where it could completely destroy your career.
Scholarship would have helped them, that author, maybe have some points of criticism of Winston Churchill, which I'm sure were valid, but in a much more nuanced way, as you said.
Yeah. Have you ever run into a situation where you have, and probably not, I'm kidding, but I'm anticipating you say yes, but you have put in the hours, you have cried, you have lost sleep, you have lost relationships because this is your life, and you present it to a professor or to an editor and they read it and go, what are you doing here? What is this? Please, you need to start over, or this is a good start, but you have a lot more work to do. You're kind of on the wrong track, that kind of pushback.
I think everybody probably has those moments. I think probably early in my grad school period was when I had the most feedback that wasn't that I was totally on the wrong track, but I just was lacking a lot of the knowledge that you learn over the course of your learning. And then being a teacher, I continue to learn now.
That's where the real learning happens.
And you know, in graduate school, you're taught to learn about a field and present information about the field. And if I were to look back on those papers now, I'd been like, wow, that was pathetically weak in its understanding. And you know, my professors didn't grade me horribly or anything like that, but you know, they said, oh, there's probably some room to push forward more in this direction.
Okay. Excellent. Well, let's talk about the person who's really made this possible. You know, this book was published in 1861, so it's not that Professor Fagan had created this publication, but a couple of things are going to go wrong as far as this becoming a mainstream text where high school students and college students are assigned, and it's part of kind of the general consciousness of slave narratives. One, and unfortunately, it's written by a Black woman, so that's a strike against her within the context of her time. How possibly could a Black woman write such a thing, right? That's going to be kind of the sentiment. And then she's writing this in the late 1850s. It's not going to be published until 1861, I think months before the Civil War. So this could have been a hot seller right off the presses if it was probably produced and published in the early 1850s. But yeah, people have other things on their minds about reading abolitionist literature at that time. So that's getting in the way. And then
and she couldn't publish it earlier because she was
yeah
fighting to keep herself safe and her exile in New York and make sure her children were healthy and happy. And
Yeah, well, we all have
Yeah.
excuses, but
Yeah.
next time she could do better. No,
Yeah.
just kidding. No, she, yeah, she had lots of challenges in her way. And the other thing too, is, so yeah, it's published during the Civil War, and it was the original editor was Marie Childs, who was a feminist and an abolitionist, very well known at this time. And it was just believed, assumed that this was a work of fiction from Child. And so probably for a good 100 years. And then the other thing too that gets in the way is this book is very well written and extraordinary, especially considering that she was in hiding for 7 years in a garret, the attic of a shed, no bigger than underneath this table and slanted. And there's other extraordinary things that happen in this. And so somebody just reading this, especially if you're of the mindset that a Black woman can never write this and all of that kind of nonsense, I could see how people would dismiss this as a work of fiction. So for 100 years, it's pretty obscure. And then in comes this historian, Fagan.
actually an English professor.
An English, oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I think she
I
maybe
just
approached this as a literary analysis
Oh.
initially and then got intrigued.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay,
but she uses the skills of a historian. for sure.
absolutely. Yeah, and she, so like you said, she's reading it probably skeptically at first. Maybe she heard about the book, and so she was at least probably entertaining that this could be a work of fiction from a historical abolitionist. But there was probably something in it that intrigued her. And she went to the archives at some point and made a case and was able to demonstrate quite conclusively that this was real. And she did put in the work, but I think based on her research, it is probably very conclusive that, yeah, this is absolutely a real story made of real people that one can trace back from point A to point B. I do know some of the problems she ran into doing her research, like with the letters, they were really dated, so that made, and then people were using pseudonyms for protection, so that made it difficult for her, but overall she accomplished it. Just to go back, I do know some of the problems Harriet Jacobs had in even publishing this book. One, the first problem she's going to have when she approaches publishers. Well, first, no, even to back up, she kind of internalizes, she was a person of profound dignity, tremendous confidence, but she did internalize just the
Sense of sin.
the sense of sin, yeah, because a lot of the stuff in the sense of shame when it comes to sexuality. So she's revealing a lot of stuff about her personal life that today, if no big deal, right? I mean, obviously, maybe having a child out of wedlock in certain circles is problematic. It certainly has some practical implications, but today, no big deal. But when she's writing this, this is at the cusp of the Victorian age. Women should be married. And so, yeah, she's revealing a lot. But she's also internalizing that, who am I? I'm just this Black woman, enslaved. And so she's first looking, before she even publishes it, before she even writes it, somebody to write it for her. So the fascinating story is she approaches Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, for those that don't know, wrote the very powerful, famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a huge impact and leading, in part, to leading to the Civil War. It wasn't the main thing, of course, but it did antagonize Southern planters quite a bit. And so just to give you an idea, this might be folklore, but it's often said that when Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln for the first time, he was supposedly said to her, "Oh, so you're the little lady that has started this great war," right? So she's very well known.
Well, wasn't it like the second best-selling book of all time behind the Bible?
Yeah.
Too. I mean, it was incredibly widely read.
Yeah, and so she's well known. So it was a reasonable, apparent person to at least approach. But it's pretty frustrating to learn this, but Harriet Beecher Stowe is looking over her notes, her outline, parts of a manuscript, and she was planning on writing a sequel to Uncle Tom's Cabin, the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she's like, great, this will be great material for my second book. And Harriet Jacobs is no fool. She's like, oh, you're just trying to co-opt my story for your own profit. And it's like, nope, not you. And it was just a really disappointing, especially, the perception of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and don't want to take anything away from her. So I'll be humble in saying this, but the fact that she was kind of falling into this age-old trope of white people co-opting Black artists. I mean, that is as old as time itself. That goes back to the minstrel shows and all the way following Elvis Presley and hip hop and blues and jazz. Harriet Beecher Stowe falls into this pattern of stealing art away from Black people for their own profit. And they could do that because if you could repackage some pretty compelling art, whether it's literature, music, theater, for a white audience as a white person, it's going to be a little bit more digestible to that white audience. So that was very disappointing to learn about that. But eventually she's determined to write this on her own. She does it. She's a nursemaid for when she escapes in the North in New York. She's working for a family. And it's a little bit problematic because the man that she's working for, even though he's Northerner, is a very staunch pro-slavery guy. So once she gets the kids down, she's done all of her daily chores, she's at candlelight writing this book out and trying to make sure that the man, the guy she works for, doesn't know about this. So she finally finishes, and then she's looking for a publisher. She approaches several publishers. And the problem for her is, and this is probably a common problem for anybody trying to write a book, is especially for something as controversial as extraordinary, this is a great book, we'd love to publish it, but we're interested in sales. And unfortunately, you have no credibility. Nobody knows who you were at, you're a former enslaved woman. And so how about we find you a well-known editor? And this is where Marie Child comes into play. And so Marie Child reads this book, and I think she's introduced to her from Amy Post, who's another very famous feminist and abolitionist as well. And Marie Child reads this book, her manuscript, and agrees to be the editor. And to my understanding, from what I've read in the critical essays, very little editing. She rearranges some of the chapters to make the flow of the story a little bit better, but she's not tearing this thing apart at all, which sometimes happens with an editor. She's just like, this book is pretty much done. Let's go forward with it. And she anticipates too. Let's see if I got anything from her child. Here we go. So this is from the original publication. The author of the following, this is from Marie Child. The following autobiography is personally known to me, and her conversation and manners inspire me with confidence. During the last 17 years, she has lived the greater part of time with a distinguished family in New York. So this is where she's writing this book, the manuscript, and so deported herself to be highly esteemed by them. This fact is sufficient without further credentials of her character, right? So that's important because she really needs to play up that this person is legitimate, should be believed and respected. I believe those who know her will not be disposed to doubt her veracity, though some incidents of her story are more romantic than fiction. Let's see. And it goes on, I do it with the hope that every man who reads this narrative will swear solemnly before God that so far as he has power to prevent it, no fugitive from slavery shall ever be sent back to suffer in that lonesome den of corruption and cruelty. Right, so this book is definitely a book of an activist. The editor is an activist, it's a polemic, not just on slavery, not just on white supremacy, but also on the patriarchy as well.
I'm so glad it was published then, because nowadays probably if you had trouble getting published, you might get told, just make it an ebook, self-publish, right? And then off into obscurity.
Yeah, well, she might.
She had to persist.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And more about Harriet Jacobs. It's not that she just published this book and she sat on her laurels. I don't think she made any money on this. Yeah. She was active in the Civil War. She nursed Union soldiers to health when she could. I'm sure she saw very harrowing and traumatic things in those makeshift hospitals. And then she would go on to be somebody that would speak out against racism, against misogyny and sexism, up until her death in 1887. Is there anything you could wanted to point out that I might have left out as far as what Fagan had to do to get this to be a credible source for high school and college students?
I mean, I think I would just say it took a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't a project that she was able to just decide, oh, I want to do this, and after a couple of years it's done. It's something where she kind of learned about it early on, young, when she was probably a graduate student in the 70s, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And she just kind of like planted seeds around, you know, informing people that, hey, I'm interested in this. And it took years for people to realize, oh, hey, in these papers by Lydia Marie Child and Amy Post, I'm seeing some letters from this woman here. And oh, this one random letter has the word Edenton. Oh, that must be where she's actually from. She wrote other books before she was able to come out with this one. This was kind of a lifelong passion project.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it turns into that because you're looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, there's
And
lots.
sometimes you don't find it.
Yeah. Yeah, one of that, the reason why I asked you that question, if you ever put a lot of pain, sweat, and tears into it, because I know that is not uncommon for somebody to put in a historian to put in a lot of work, a lot of research, and then they send it to their professor or to editors or peer review, and it is sent back rejected. And
well, and sometimes you go looking at a particular source really excited that this is going to be what you needed to demonstrate X, Y, or Z, and then it really disappoints you and you're just like,
yeah, and that
dang.
was probably something that Fagan was very, Yellin was probably very aware that could have happened, that this could have been just a rabbit hole that led to nowhere. Where did I want to read from Fagan's book? Yeah, so I think what Jean Fagan Yellin really appreciated about the text that probably encouraged her to pursue this and to legitimize this, because that's essentially what she's known for instance, The Life of a Slave Girl is legitimizing this book, so it could be assigned and seen as a piece of literature and scholarship for historians that are studying the antebellum and slavery and white supremacy and the patriarchy. But yeah, she concludes, towards the end of this critical essay in this Norton publication, she writes, thus it presents a double critique, and this is she's referring to the book itself, of our 19th century ideas and institutions. It inevitably challenges not only the institution of chattel slavery and its supporting ideology of white supremacy, it also challenges traditional patriarchal institutions and ideas. Right? And that is something that wasn't necessarily the last part, the patriarchal institution ideas. It wasn't something I was surprised to find in this book, which is at the center of a lot of what she's writing, but it offered me a greater appreciation of the problems of patriarchy, where the man is in charge of the state, the man, it lords over the family, whether he has a plantation or a small home, right? He is the head of the family. He lords over the wife, the children, and if you have slaves, you lord over them. And it doesn't just present problems. What's fascinating about this book, it doesn't just present obvious problems for a wife that is in that situation, or the children, or the slaves whose will is at the whim of this man, whoever that might be. But and what is highlighted in here is it destroys the man himself. It makes for weak men. This is a problem to this very second. If the goal, I think, of any romantic lifelong relationship is to have a very enriched partner who has their own needs and interests, and sometimes you share those interests, but a healthy way of approaching any relationship, even beyond a romantic friendship, colleague, is you don't have expectations of them. You are the mystery of the person in front of you, and every day is different, and you relish that. That is all taken away from you if you have this position of authority where you're lording over them. And the end result is, for a lot of men, I think they become embittered and stagnant in their heart and in their soul, because they end up with not just a partner, but everybody around them. Their souls are destroyed. And that makes for kind of just boring company. You're just around people who are intimidated by you, who have been used to being beaten down and aren't going to share what's actually in their mind and heart, because they are so afraid of offending you in your brittle ego. That was one of the things that I really took away from it. And you hear these issues ongoing today. There's the whole thing. Well, let me explain to you that this problem still exists. Now, the whole incel movement, right? This is at the heart of it. This idea that men are entitled to partners, and if they aren't, then there must be something wrong with the women out there, right? That is what we're seeing today, is the legacy of this problem that goes back millennia. This isn't obviously exclusive to American history. It's part and parcel probably of civilization itself. And so I think it's a great book for, even if you can't relate to what it might be like to be a Black woman, certainly an enslaved woman. For young men, certainly for myself, just to let everyone know, I have suffered from being a man. It was very revealing and was very humbling, and gave me kind of strength to go, okay, right? If I'm ever, because we're all guilty of this. I mean, I've never felt myself to be a patriarch. I've never felt myself to be entitled to lord over anyone, let alone women, but I'm a product of the society. And the running script in the back of my head is there. And there's a lot of things that I've just gotten in trouble. Relationships have gone toxic in my life. And that's not unique to me. It's sort of something that happens to a lot of people. And so this gives you a firsthand account of what it's like. I mean, literally, Dr. Flint, Dr. Norcom, the actual person, is basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you. I lord over you. You must do what I want. And it's so toxic and poisoning. And there's a sense, too, that when you hear about stories of the patriarchy and what happens, that even though you can disagree, like men shouldn't disagree with that, you still have a sense of, well, there's some power there. And it's kind of interesting. I disagree with what's happening, but with power comes respect. It's very mucky, but what you read in this is a little boy. It's pathetic. This is a person who has not fully developed as a man. And when you're reading this, and there's a part where he grabs her by the head. She talks back. What's great is she talks back to this guy all the time. At one point, he has it, and grabs her by the hair, cuts all of her hair off, and he's beating her and yelling and screaming. It's a terrible part in this book, and there's nothing powerful about it at all. It's pathetic. It's a child throwing his toys in the room because he's not getting his way.
Well, in the system, he would have been the master of slaves as a young boy.
Mm-hmm.
And And so he already had what he wanted when he was 6 years old. And so why wouldn't he need to grow up?
Yeah, and that's what destroys people who are the benefactor of a system, an oppressive system like this, whether it's a patriarchy or slavery or whatever the case is. You never get to fully develop. You never get to hear what somebody who you're rubbing up against, who isn't appreciating your authority or your points of view, going, I don't actually like what you're saying or how you're behaving. Nothing personal, but if you want us to be friends or have a relationship, you might want to change course here, right? Never would they hear that. So why would you why would you develop into a fully functioning man? He's stuck as a little boy. Kind of reminds me of Stephen Crowder's debacle. For those who don't know, it doesn't matter. Don't look into him. He's a weird guy, but he's a right-wing influencer. And he's got known for debating freshman college students, and which was a big accomplishment because when you're a freshman, you're just new to ideas, and if you got somebody who's taken the time to, wouldn't give him that kind of credit, but at least he probably did his homework and he would embarrass freshmen on their political views. But what this book reminds me of is he was, surprise, he had a wife that their marriage wasn't going too well. There was a footage that they were getting a divorce, and the wife, because their custody battle and their divorce proceedings were getting pretty toxic, and he was just basically trying to take everything, including the children and all the wealth that they had developed, which they had developed quite a bit. The Ring camera footage was leaked to social media. And what you see is Stephen Crowder in his shorts, smoking a cigar in front of his eight-month, literally barefoot pregnant wife, berating her because she wasn't going to insert medication in the anus of their dogs because the medication is toxic to the developing baby in her belly. Right? And so she was taking a stance. And he's like, why don't you just put on some gloves? And she's like, we're not having this conversation. I need to go to the store. And these people are multimillionaires. And it turns out that they only have one car. He's like, no, I need the car because I'm going to go hang out with my boys.
Wow,
And totally controlling. And it's ugly. If you're interested in it, do a search and find it. But it's awful stuff. But what you're seeing is this pathetic little boy who is whining, literally just whining at this woman and just putting all this toxicity. I mean, when you're pregnant, if you ever have a wife or a partner who has a baby, you certainly don't need to ever not say what's on your mind, but you need to be very nuanced and gentle because there's a lot of hormonal changes, and if you stress a person out who's about to have a baby, that's going to have an effect on the baby. So if anything, if you care about your baby, make sure the woman is as comfortable, happy, and supported as possible. And that was not happening in this interaction at all.
This is the spouse of the doula.
Yeah, I've been taught very, very well. Thank you. Thanks to my wife, Brandy. But yeah, and again, it's just an example of where you might be of the understanding of, oh, there's power when you're able to lord over your wife. When you actually see it, it looks pathetic. It looks like a little child trapped in a grown man's body, and therefore it's dangerous. But wow, we are right at the end of time. Were any students joining in?
We had one student join in. Yes.
Okay. Did they? If they're still there, if you happen to have a question or a comment, you're typing. Okay, excellent.
Just ask them if they have a comment to put it in the chat.
Okay, excellent. Right. So if that question or comment comes in, we could address that. But is there anything else that you would like to conclude with?
I just appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. We weren't really sure what this conversation was going to go into, but I think it's been interesting to hear everything that you have to say about the book.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and sharing what it's like to be an historian. Again, I'm not a historian.
Sure you are.
I teach, no, I'm not. I teach history. A historian is somebody who actually does the work. The only research I've ever done was in graduate school for a grade. So.
Well, we'll debate about that more.
Okay, on the next podcast, the debate if I'm a historian or not. And so, but thank you very much to a true historian, and until next time, we'll be talking to you later. And just to students out there, we will be having some podcasts on the current common reading text assigned to various different students throughout this college, Heart of Darkness. And so our first podcast will be on September 23rd at 1 o'clock with Lillian Anderson from the English department. So that should be a fascinating talk. It's again, yeah, nothing we ever assign is uplifting and inspiring. The Heart of Darkness is definitely rivals how depressing and just terrible the human animal can be at times. Excellent. Thank you very much. No comments or questions, Simon?
No,
Okay. All right. You guys have a great afternoon. I'll talk with you all later. Thank you very much. See you later.